Buenas tardes, familia. Good afternoon. I am Frankie Miranda, President of the Hispanic Federation. Welcome to the Hispanic Education Summit. We're honored to have you join us today, our first virtual summit, a national convening of our country's top education leaders. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Hispanic Federation, we're a national nonprofit organization that works to uplift the Latino community by focusing on grant making, advocacy, and community programs. We have been around for 30 years, and we work in partnership with over 250 organizations across the country to ensure Latinos have access to adequate social service support and opportunities. But this year, we'll agree, is different, much different. Natural and man-made disasters continue to have a disproportionate impact on our community and threaten our people's health, basic rights, ability to earn a living, and future prosperity. We know what is at stake and that the current situation requires us to do even more and think outside of the box. Indeed, we understood that early on, that this is an unprecedented crisis and that it required an unprecedented response. Let's take a look at a short video narrated by another more famous Miranda, Lin-Manuel Miranda, at how the Hispanic Federation responded to our community needs in this time of crisis. Let's take a look.
We were created in crisis. Leaders and communities coming together, fighting for quality education, for health access and equity, for fair housing and greater economic opportunities, for social justice and equality. All these issues served as the catalyst for our creation. Organizations of, by, and for our community. Institutions working on the front lines. Latino nonprofits whose vision, purpose, and relevance grows stronger and more important every day. For 3 decades now, the Hispanic Federation has worked with these essential organizations to build a network of care and support for Latino children, seniors, workers, and families. They are our brother's keepers, and of our tias and abuelitas too, always there to provide a vital lifeline of support for the most vulnerable among us. The COVID-19 pandemic has tested us, but our work has never wavered. Our response has been what it needed to be, unparalleled and unprecedented. After all, we know what it is to respond to crisis, to find ways to steel yourself and stretch to address loss and mounting needs, to respond always with compassion and commitment, with knowledge and leadership, with resiliency and vision. That's the power of our network. We've worked all across the nation to help those most affected and injured by the pandemic, providing aid to children and families living in poverty, comfort to our elderly, refuge to migrant families, care for the sick, and sustenance and protection to our essential workers. As always, we've said presente, feeding families, keeping them in their homes, providing protective equipment and tools for online learning, advocating fiercely for the safety and care of our communities. Their power, our power. Power to show up first, to serve, to stay, to give hope, to lift up. The power to embrace our values, our heritage, our legacy, and our future. The power of us. We are the Hispanic Federation, taking Hispanic causes to heart.
Adding to these pandemic-related challenges is the existential threat to public education. We have seen attacks on public schools, attempts to undermine teachers, and budget cuts sharply affecting programming and the core functions of elementary and secondary schools and colleges and universities. And that is why during this summit, we won't limit our conversation to matters of education alone, but we will offer opportunities to analyze and strategize about the best ways to defend public education from those who seek to weaken it. Latinos, African Americans, and people of color have long been disenfranchised and negatively impacted by national policies, especially regarding education. And That, of course, is part of the reason we are all here today, because we share a deep concern for the nation's state of education and want to make a difference and improve educational outcomes for our community. Across the country, Latinos identify education as one of the most important issues facing their communities. And given the state of Latino education, this is not surprising. The challenges are clear. The gaps are evident. Latinx Black students are not achieving at the rates of their peers, from math and English performance to high school graduation. In fact, these rates are especially alarming when we hone in on English language learners. High percentages of students of color enter college taking remedial coursework in their first semester, and although more Latino students are enrolling in college, Latina college completion rates are stagnant, and parents are not empowered to make a significant difference in their child's education. And the list goes on. Compound these pre-existing issues with a global health pandemic, and families have an impossible set of challenges to obtain education. We can and must do more to ensure that all students receive a quality education, one that sets them for success regardless of their zip code. In fact, the fact that so many of you made it a priority to be here today in this virtual space speaks volumes about your concerns regarding the state of education in this country, not only for Latinos, but for all children. Over the course of the next 3 days, we will hear from community leaders, parents, students, policymakers, union leaders, education experts committed to advancing best practices and needed reforms, focusing on reimagining education and strengthening pathways to post-secondary success, while also addressing other important issues such as racial equality in schools and how immigration policies affect our students and families. In short, we are here to discuss, share, and recommend best practices and model programs that effectively support Latino student success through school, career, and life. The recommendations that come forward will be compiled into a report and drive education policy agenda that we will share with city, state, federal officials from across the country. We are in a battle for the soul of our nation, por nuestro futuro, and we are honored to work alongside with you to fight for justice, fairness, and opportunities that our community deserves. But before we start our day, I want to talk to you about the platform we're using. It is intended to create an interactive experience for all participants to meet speakers and connect with other attendees from across the country. We encourage you to visit the main agenda page to view the list of activity schedules for the next 3 days, which are packed with panel discussions, fireside chats, booth expos, and virtual mixers. During the panel sessions, attendees will be able to chat, but also grab the mic and join the panelists on stage to ask questions. We also have a booth expo where you will be able to engage directly with experts on topics ranging from immigration to federal policy and advocacy. And you will have the opportunity to network and connect one-on-one with other attendees from around the country during our virtual mixer. The platform will match you with someone new every 5 minutes, so make sure to be camera ready. And of course, you can also participate in these discussions via Twitter using the handle HispanicFed and the hashtag HispanicFed. Again, that's at HispanicFed and hashtag HispanicFed. And if we're going to be social today, I love to make sure that we start our first group photo or group feed through the platform so we can start all sharing. I'm going to start. I'm going to see how we are going to be able to do this, and I'm going to give you quick instructions. We should all receive a prompt that says take selfie, and when you use that, you select the selfie and automatically submit. Once everyone has shared, I will end the group free, and you should all have the final image. Whoever participates in the picture, you will also receive a copy of the group image via email through Run the World app if you have downloaded it. Okay, so let's get ready. Let's start the group selfie. I'm going to give them a few more seconds. Everybody, use this one button. And let's see. I encourage everybody to take. There are 4 or 5 people. Come on. A few more. Excellent. A few more seconds. And that is it. We now have our first group fee. So let me introduce now the first plenary. Immediately following this talk, please join us for our first plenary session kicking off at 1:40 in a few minutes Eastern Time, 1:40 Eastern Time, which will focus on the future of education. We will hear from state education superintendents, commissioners, and union presidents that will engage in an exciting dialogue concerning opportunities for K-12 Latino students and the current crisis and beyond. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to have you in the activities of the very first virtual Hispanic Education Summit. Thank you very much.
Where's my mute button? Right here, right?
Senator Jackson, you may begin. Please unmute yourself.
So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hispanic Education Summit. I appreciate all of you from all over the country to join in. You have the knowledge and expertise in order to assist us in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on the Latinx community and communities of color, and especially communities with economic distress is affecting everyone. So let me just thank all of you for being here this afternoon. And obviously there are some questions that I have of all of you, but let me just say, who do we have here? We have Tony Thurman, the State Superintendent of Public Education. Tony, would you wave your hand so everybody can see you? Good. And we have Dr. Miguel Cardona, who is the Superintendent of Education in the state of Connecticut. So could you wave your hand, sir? Good. And Associate Commissioner for Bilingual Education and World Languages at the New York State Department of Education. We have, I apologize to you. We have Eliza Alvarez.
No worries. Thank you. Great to be here.
And then we also have Dr. Carmen Ayala, who is the State Superintendent of the state of Illinois. So welcome. And of course, we have Randy Weingarten, a New Yorker, someone that I've known for decades. He is the president of the AFT, if you don't know what that stands for, the American Federation of Teachers. So let me thank you all for coming in. And obviously, this is a very, very important summit. And as you know, the summit is going to be over 3 days. But today, we're just facing the issue of COVID-19 and the effect it has on the Latinx community. And today, I hope to cover these areas. 1, access to technology. 2, mental support. 3, families not able to meet the basic needs. And 4, racial inequality. And obviously, I know that those subject matters, you can talk about 5 to 10 minutes on each one and even more than that. But we're going to ask you to be as succinct as possible within 30 seconds to 1 minute to see if you can answer it in any way you can, so that everyone will have an opportunity to hear from each one of you as a panelist with years of experience in education and dealing with the communities that we represent. So here's a question that I'm going to throw out to Tony Thurman, who is the superintendent of the state of California. Students are entering back to school with more academic variability in their academics than in the regular times. How can institutions prepare to not exacerbate the widening academic achievement gaps that we are facing during this pandemic? So Tony, if you could take 1 minute to answer that, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning, buenos dias, good afternoon, buenos tardes de California, where it is still morning. Senator, I would just want to commend our students, our educators, and our families for their resilience during these unprecedented times. There's no question that the pandemic, the human pandemic of racism, has impacted all of our students in their ability to learn. What we know is that our students need safety protocols, that they need anti-racism and anti-bias training, social emotional learning, and we have to have a kind of family engagement that makes sure that all of our families are connected, not just to a computer, but connected to the school community. And that's why we've launched a task force on closing the digital divide, because we've got 1 million students in our state who do not have access to the internet. We have to make these things our priority to make sure that all of our students can be connected to their great educators and have the ability to continue to learn. Even in the face of these challenges, our students continue to learn. But we have to do more to close the digital divide. We have to provide more family engagement support to make sure that our families are connected, and to provide in our education training, which I'll talk about today, to address racism and bias that exists in our school culture and in the nation at large.
Well, thank you. And let me just turn to the superintendent of the state of Illinois. It's the same questions. How are we dealing with this COVID-19 with the Latinx community, knowing that the academic variability in their academics that in regular time it's tougher, and institutions can prepare not to exacerbate the widening academic achievement gap that they're receiving right now. And everyone knows that we're not receiving the type of education we should. So I turn to you, Dr. Ayala.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. In Illinois, we have dedicated a great portion of our CARES funding and have specifically indicated that schools that are in our evidence-based funding formula that we have in the state who are not at what we call adequacy, that those schools receive priority in order to access devices as well as connectivity. And so in the state of Illinois, many of our Black and Brown communities are those schools that don't have the adequacy levels that we have set before them. And so those are the schools that are accessing these $80 million worth of grant funds to be able to address the digital divide. In addition to that, being the first Latina in the position that I hold, and I'm just so humbled and honored for that, we have put out guidance documents, and those documents are provided in languages other than English as well. I think that one of the things that we need to remember in our Latinx community is that there is a range of English proficiency as well as a range of Spanish proficiency. And so we need to make sure that that information is provided in a way that our parents can access and be able to understand and support their children in schools with. And so Illinois has 852 separate, distinct, different districts. And so we work very hard at trying to make sure that the needs, particularly of our Black and Brown students, are being addressed, especially during this pandemic.
Thank you, Doctor. And so let me turn to the Associate Commissioner, Eliza Alvarez, because now I'm dealing with the California, Illinois, now New York State. And then we're going to go to Randy Weingarten, who represents all of the teachers and the impact it's having from their perspective. But first, Eliza Alvarez, please give me the perspective on how you're dealing with it in New York State Department of Education.
Well, to continue and add to what my colleagues have stated, first and foremost, good afternoon y buenas tardes a todos. Thank you to the organization for providing us a platform to reach so many advocates and interested members to let them know that we are united and together in this endeavor. To add to what my colleagues have shared, I would state that in New York State specifically, we're focusing a tremendous amount of energy in making sure that our families are receiving the information that they so rightfully need. Not only making sure that we try to communicate with them, but that we communicate with them in the language of their choice and in the mode of communication as best possible. We are also attempting, and we have provided various platforms where we warehouse information where teachers and administrators are able to receive additional guidance, resources, documents to provide support for them as they try to continue to support our children in these most difficult times. And one of the things also that we've done at the state is make sure that we reach our families through public service announcements. We've opened up sessions through our 8 regional bilingual educational resource networks that are placed strategically all throughout the state. And we provide town hall sessions where we make sure that we communicate with our families in their language of preference and after working hours to make sure that they know how to navigate the information, not only educationally, but also in terms of their health and any of the needs that their families would need. We have a Bill of Rights for parents specifically, to ensure that the families are aware of the rights that they have, and making sure that they know where to find assistance throughout their community area.
Thank you. So now I'm going to turn to Dr. Cardona, who is the Commissioner of Education for the state of Connecticut, and he is an experienced over 2 decades and 10 years as a principal in the school. So Dr. Cardona, tell me what's happening in Connecticut with respect to the same issue on how you are addressing this, considering the divide that takes place and the impact it's having on communities of color, especially the Latinx community and families that are economically on the low totem pole in that respect?
Sure, thank you.
You know,
Happy to answer, happy to be a part of this, and happy to be here with colleagues. Look forward to learning from you and appreciate your presence here today too. You know, a couple quick things. First of all, you know, addressing the barriers, whether that's the digital divide, access to technology, connectivity, or food. I think the key thing is we're keeping those meals going. We want to make sure that kids have access to healthy meals. We want to make sure they have access to technology and to good content. But I think it's also taking a step back and saying we need to have the mindset that we still want to make sure that we're providing the best opportunity for public education for our students. And cautioning ourselves against the what I call the ay bendito effect. The poor thing, the poor kid, he has so much against him, so I'm going to lower expectations. Not at all. We're going to support them socially and emotionally first, and we're going to make sure that we're providing opportunities for them to learn and grow, because this is their year, and they'll never get this year back, so we have to do everything in our power to continue to work collaboratively with all our partners to make sure we get the best public education possible.
well, thank you. So, Randy, now you've listened to these educators, and all of them are with the state education department in one state or another. But you're the president of AFT, the American Federation of Teachers. So, from your perspective, representing millions of teachers around the country, how do you see that the system overall, whether or not it's in California, New York, Connecticut, or Illinois, how are they dealing with this whole issue from your perspective as a representative of one of the largest labor unions in the country?
I see you now, but Robert, do you see me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So look, I am in a bus. We've spent 33 days, Superintendent Thurman, going from your state, and I've been in several of your states, and we're doing 33 days in a bus from California to Pennsylvania down to Florida, being very COVID protected. I wear my mask almost all the time, and you know, even if I'm 6 feet away from people, and we take tests all the time, and we've been very mindful of all the quarantine requirements. I say that way because every one of the superintendents who are here, and you know this well, Senator, in terms of New York, everybody is trying their hardest. I've never, you know, the level of work that is expected of everyone right now is something that I don't think any of us ever, you know, we all work very hard on behalf of children. What is challenging us right now is something I don't think any of us ever expected that we would have been doing, you know, when we start educators. I think so. I say that as an intro to say that there are no good choices right now. And as much as people are really trying, we're in the middle of a pandemic. People like Tony Fauci and Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx have actually asked for the current head of it, Dr. Atlas, to be removed because he seems to just want to get everybody, you know, everybody just spread COVID. And there's a recklessness there and a denial there that makes it really hard on all of us, because the thing that you need to do in a public health pandemic is you have to be consistent, honest, and transparent. And when you don't have any of that coming from the federal government, it makes it excruciatingly hard on everyone else, because what is happening is that people's own particular sense of their own risk and their own needs kind of take over from anything, any of what the scientists are saying. So there is agita. As a result, there is agita everywhere. And in the polling that we've done, it's particularly more intense in Black and Brown communities because the effect of COVID has been more intense and the inequities more intense there. So I would say agita everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll get to the point, the last point I'll make is this.
Good.
That there is a set of science that could help us with safety and health measures. And there is resources that we know that would help with instruction, whether we're remote, hybrid, or more fully in person.
Okay.
So it's the agita, it's the kind of dissonance, and then it's the lack of resources.
Okay. So here's the question that I asked of all of you. So think about this when I'm coming to you. So the state of New York has basically held up 20% of education funding all around the state, no matter whether it's a city or urban or rural areas, and it has a negative impact, in my opinion. Obviously, if you're a big municipality and you have a lot of money to be flexible and juggle, then you can survive that. Others have started to lay off people. So in the state of California, Illinois, Connecticut, and in New York State, I've just mentioned that. But can you tell me whether or not they've cut funding in education, and what is the primary impact that's having on your state? And take 1 minute, please, at the most, to answer that. And I'm going to start with, go back to California, Illinois, Connecticut, New York. And then Randy, I want to hear from you as to, from your perspective, how is that impacting the workplace that you represent? So go ahead, Dr. Thurman.
Senator, thank you. California's budget, like every state's budget, has been decimated by the impacts of COVID, and that's where we get our funding from. However, the state has been able to hold funding stable based on previous years for our state. And our governor and our legislature have provided $5.2 billion to support distance learning for computing devices, for social emotional learning and counseling, and for training for teachers. The reality is it's not enough. Even with all of that, it's not enough. California has remained 39th in per pupil spending for many years. We have a ballot measure right now that our voters will be making a decision on called Prop 15 that would essentially take more funding from corporations that have withheld property taxes for decades in order to right-size the formula for funding in our state. It would generate another $11 billion for K-12 education and for higher education and for cities and counties. Like you, I was a school board member before the legislature, and I understand that our school districts are struggling, our cities and counties are struggling. And so this is a time when we need support from our federal government that our president has withheld. We need the federal stimulus to support our small businesses and to support our schools. In the meantime, California is struggling. We've made some small cuts, but we've held funding stable based on past years' funding formulas.
Superintendent of Illinois, the floor is yours. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. In Illinois, a couple of years ago, we enacted a new evidence-based funding formula. The two pillars of this formula are adequacy, how much does it take to educate a student in Illinois, and equity. So for the first time in Illinois history, school districts that are most at need receive the most dollars. And so we have worked very hard at making sure that our school districts most of need are getting the most resources. In addition to that, there are 3 additional buckets that receive additional resources. One is our students with individualized education plans, our low-income students, and our English learners. And so these are 3 additional sources of funds that are provided for these specific types of students. Now, in that formula is a guarantee that districts will not receive less than what they received the year prior. So due to that, we have stabilized the funding. There were no cuts, if you will, to funding. And so because school districts are guaranteed to receive the same amount of funding.
So you're telling, I'm going to ask a quick question. You're telling me based on that, the way the state legislature has done this, that you're not holding up money like New York City and New York State?
No.
Okay.
No.
So basically you have the same amount of funding as last year also?
It's guaranteed.
Guaranteed, like California, I guess, in that respect. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
So let me, if you don't mind, I want to just turn to Connecticut. Are you have a reduction in spending, or you're back at the same level? You heard me say that New York City has held up 20%. And people are saying, and we're saying, wait a minute, you have billions of dollars in care money. And if I'm this federal government, right? And you're asking for money, but you have $4 billion that you haven't spent. And I'm going to say, wait a minute, you haven't spent the money that you have. How can you be asking me for more? So just answer that question as far as,
Sure.
Tell me about Connecticut.
You know, I'm really proud, like California and Illinois, we have not cut any funds from the state. In fact, the governor put forth $266 million. Over half of that went to the 30 poorest communities. So over half of that allotment went to the poorest communities to help with reopening schools and making sure they have the necessary PPEs. There was a commitment to fully fund PPEs in Connecticut for all educators and students that need it. You know, this is one of the largest state funding plans per student. We're proud of that. Obviously, as was mentioned earlier, additional funds to continue the work is needed. We're proud, though, under some of the funding went toward an Everybody Learns initiative, where we're providing, removing the obstacle of devices. And 97% of our kids have been logged on and connected. We're proud of that, but that 3% that hasn't, that's our focus right now. We need to make sure 100% of our students are connected.
Okay, and now I turn to the Associate Commissioner in New York. Can you tell me, is it true that 20% of education funding has been held up around the state? As a state legislature, I know that the impact on New York City was about $2.4 billion. And and I know that teachers in Rochester and Yonkers and other locations have been let go. So why do we have this situation? You just heard California, Illinois, and Connecticut say that basically they're at the same funding level as last year at the minimum. But tell us about New York State, if you can.
Thank you, Senator. Well, I think in New York, part of the issue is that some of those districts that you mentioned were already suffering from a financial hardship and crisis prior to the COVID pandemic. I can say that in terms of the funding that our English language learners receive specifically, that has not been touched at all. There has been no reduction. They continue to receive their Title III funding. In addition to that, our commissioner, Commissioner Dr. Rosa, has made sure with the Board of Regents that they have stayed and remained at the helm of our educational system, provide and received grant funding to support the districts as best possible in making sure they can address first and foremost the inequities that exist, and making sure that the teachers have enough professional development virtually, of course, which at the other aspect, we're trying to make the best of a very difficult situation, as we know that this life will never be the same. We will never go back to instruction as before. But one of the things that we have done is to make sure that we have united stronger, not only with knowledge, but supporting one another across the entire state to make sure that we can address the needs of all our learners, not only in New York City, but all the way to the Seneca Nation that we service the children from indigenous languages. So in terms of English language learners, our English language learners with disabilities, our students with disabilities, their funding has not been touched. But yes, the districts are having hardships. There have been a tremendous amount of delays. The funding that has been withheld has not been through our New York State Education Department. That has been from other aspects.
So you mean
the
executive department, the governor's office? Basically, that's what you're talking about. You're being very diplomatic. Let's call it like it is, the executive department. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. We will always continue to be advocates of children, and we continue to promote there's no reason we were ever support cutting of the funding for our children, especially those that need it desperately. Good.
Now, Randy Weingarten, you know, your state affiliate is the New York State United Teachers, and obviously that's statewide, and then UFT in New York City. But the impact on the reduction in funding, can you tell me what the local leaders are communicating to you as the president of AFT and the impact that's having on students and teachers, and whether or not there's been reductions, so forth and so on?
Okay, so let me tell you on on a state basis, the answer is yes. In California, yes. In Illinois, yes. In Connecticut, yes. And so I know the state leaders are trying to, immunize most vulnerable kids as much as possible. But all throughout the country, we've basically had a 20% cut in revenues that go to states because of COVID, and we've seen real cuts in places all around the country. There are already almost over 600,000 education employees who have been laid off. There's a prediction if we do not get the COVID relief that Nancy Pelosi is trying to do, and the House of Representatives, there's going to be 1.4 million education workers who are laid off. That's not my figures. That's the one of the National Budget Committee's figures. And
you said 1 point what?
1.4 million.
1.4 million.
Professionals, a lot of paraprofessionals, a lot of workers who work paycheck to paycheck have already been laid off. In New York, you have huge layoffs in Albany, Rochester. We are seeing it in different places in California, paraprofessionals and others, and I'm sure that that's true other places as well. And so, but we need, this is my point. You actually need 20% more right now. You actually, so 90% of teachers are paying for their own PPE. You got still right now, Senator Markey and Senator Van Hollen's estimate, 16 million kids don't have the necessary equipment. And you're hearing from these state superintendents just a patchwork about how to pull things together. We actually really need, like Baltimore, the Wolf School in Baltimore, and there are several schools like this in Ohio, in Connecticut is trying to do this, New York City is trying to do this. Those places that had wraparound services and community school process beforehand, where they had the kind of services that kids needed, have been able to deal with a lot of the trauma better than others. That's expensive. That's the cost of guidance counselors, the cost of PTs, OTs, the cost of food, the cost of nurses. So you actually need 20% more to deal with the mental health supports, the instructional supports, and the safety safeguards. And we now basically have 20% less. So that's getting us to really horrible situations on hybrid learning, for example, where in many districts, because they can't do it any other way, you're seeing somebody live stream instruction and have instruction in class at the same time. And I don't know about these superintendents, but I think that is a horrible, it doesn't work. It doesn't help kids. You can't reach kids individually. You got to have remote teachers dealing with remote, in school dealing with in school. And teachers are at a burnout stage already, and it's just October.
Good. Well, so here's the question. So I don't know the percentage of Black and brown children, the Latinx population in each one of your states. But I know I heard in New York City, basically that about 77,000 students are without electronic devices. And the chancellor said that, like, around the country, everyone is trying to get them, but there's 77,000 students that don't have a laptop or an iPad and what have you. Give me the numbers that are negatively impacting your states. And let me go with Illinois first, and then Connecticut, then California. If you don't mind, take a minute to tell me if you know. And if you don't know, it's okay. I know that, I'm not talking to a computer that can put out an answer instantaneously. So, Superintendent of Illinois, help me out.
Yes, thank you. When the pandemic first hit, we did a survey of all of our school districts, as I mentioned, 852 of them. And we discovered that we had a third of our students across the state of Illinois did not have connectivity or devices. And so this is why when the federal CARES funding hit Illinois, we pretty much dedicated the majority of that funding in trying to address the digital divide. It isn't about the devices so much as families didn't have connectivity. And we also have some dead spots in the state that need broadband, need the internet. And so that is the focus that we have had. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, evidence-based formula and our adequacy targets and all of that, many of our Black and brown schools are the schools that may not have access to the technology. So the funding was really focused towards those situations and trying to close that digital divide. So we've had a third at the beginning, and we are beginning to recollect some information because we need to continue to measure impact. What has been the impact? How have we improved? What else is still out there in terms of need? So that when we do get some additional monies from the federal government, we can continue to target and further close that divide. It's important for all kids across the state.
How many students, in your opinion, if you have an opinion on that, are without devices or don't have connectivity? How many students is it impacting? Give me a broad number if you can. And if you can't, just say I can't.
Well, Illinois has almost 2 million public school students, and so a third of that.
A third of that. Okay, thank you. The Superintendent of California, Dr. Cardona, tell me about students that don't have laptops or don't have iPads or problem with connectivity. If you have an opinion on that, and what are you doing about it? And trying to ask
Sure.
questions.
Was that directed toward me? Was that directed to me? Yes.
Yeah, I'm talking to you.
Okay, good. So first of all, I want to give a shout out really quick to Paula Rivera from Puerto Rico. My family is from Aguada. Paula, thank you for being on. Nice to see so many people from all over. Yeah, obviously, the digital divide is something that's going to be ongoing. So we did a survey early on to see how many families where technology was a barrier to learning, and we worked really hard to try to get computers out there. And I want to publicly thank the Dalio Foundation for providing 60,000 laptops to our neediest communities. They helped. We had philanthropy step up. So we feel, as I said earlier, out of the 160,000 students in Connecticut whose families chose all remote learning, 97% of them have been connected, have devices. There's 3%, some of whom already have a device. That's about 5,000 students who we are still trying to track down. So the work continues, until you get everyone connected, the work continues. So we're pleased that we have devices. We were fortunate to order very early. We have the shipments coming in now, but as was mentioned earlier, the connectivity in some parts of Connecticut is really difficult. And then I think the other part of that three-legged stool that hasn't been mentioned is we want to make sure that there's quality content, right? So you could have a device, you could have connectivity, but if what you're connecting to is very low quality or low bar, that also impacts learning. So we're working with districts to try to lift up a system that has a basic minimum of quality instruction connected to high standards for our learners.
State of California.
Senator, it is an embarrassment that in the U.S., with all the resources that we have allowed the digital divide to exist for decades, and it largely impacts African-American students and Latinos, low-income students, and students who live in rural communities who cannot get access to the infrastructure that is needed to create broadband. And so I created a task force on closing the digital divide. In the early days, we had estimates that maybe 1 million students without a computing device at home and another 1 million students without access to internet. Now, we've had many donate hotspots, hundreds of thousands of donations and hotspots and computing devices from foundations, from the corporations. We're grateful for that. We pulled in all the internet service providers and told them they needed to provide free internet to families and low-cost internet, but they had to do it with no hoops. We said, look, you cannot ask a family for the social security number. You cannot ask them about their financial history. And they did it. Now, we had a bunch of legislators like yourself in that task force because we knew we needed that kind of accountability from the ISPs. And they came through and we said, hey, if a family doesn't have a computer, don't ask them to email you if they can't get hooked up to your reduced cost internet. Each of the ISPs provided a liaison to answer the phone when our families call, and we actually have liaisons speaking Spanish. It's been a great start, but we have a long way to go to make sure that all of our, in our rural communities, students can't get internet at all because of the lack of infrastructure. We're working on some measures to generate $4 billion to make sure that we can build the infrastructure in California to make sure that all of our students have high-speed internet. We want internet connectivity to flow like electricity for all of our students, not just during the pandemic, but when they get back in school so they can prepare for the jobs of tomorrow.
Tell me how many students, in your opinion, in the state of California without connectivity or without an iPad or laptop, in your opinion?
As the pandemic started, all the companies bought up all the computing devices. So we have a worldwide run on supply. And at one point, our schools have been quoted. They said, we'll get you devices in October, November, December. I said, our kids can't wait. We connected with Apple and T-Mobile, and they said, we'll get you another 1 million devices, an internet-enabled device at low cost. And of course, our state's given $5 billion to school districts to buy these resources. And so, we're doing what we can to get around the gaps that exist. There's probably still 1 million students who need access to high-speed internet in the state.
And how many students in California do you have?
We have 6 million students.
6 million. Okay. So, Associate Commissioner in New York State. I mean, I live in New York State. I know the situation in New York City. The Chancellor gave testimony at City Council hearings. He said there's about 77,000. But you and I know there's probably a higher number than that. Understanding. So, can you, if you know of any statistics regarding, how many students, in your opinion, if you can give it, that are without a laptop or iPad or connectivity? I hear from my colleagues who represent rural areas that the connectivity is the major issue that's impacting them out there. So if you have any information on that, share with us about New York State, please.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We have about 2.6 million children in New York State, and New York City has about 1.1 million, makes up of the rest of the state. Now, unfortunately, and sadly to say, based on many of the comments my colleagues have shared, for the fact that there is a tremendous need and demand for devices, that has made it very difficult throughout the state in its entirety. We created a task force in the beginning of this pandemic. We included all stakeholders, including students themselves, parents, parent advocates, as well as superintendents and other members, to just hear what was it that they needed in order for us to provide support. But the harsh reality has a few things. We at least have, with the survey that we created, information we received, we have to resend out another survey to just gather information on not only connectivity, but devices held. We have at least 1/3, just like my colleague stated in her area, that still need devices. We're waiting on devices. But most importantly is that we also have to be aware that our children, it's not only one child to a home. We have families that we service, our families that live together, must move in order to remain safe during this pandemic and have not only the safety, but provide food, clothing, and shelter appropriately to our families that can no longer go out and receive the food supplies that they rightfully deserve, because now they're afraid because they are an immigrant family and they can no longer get there. So we have a combination of issues. Some areas are saying even though the districts might have the devices, they can't get it to the family, Senator, because the families are afraid to come outside for fear that they are going to be removed and through immigration status and no longer be able to stay in New York State. So we have twofold to that. I would like to answer in that fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. So Randy Weingarten, what are you hearing from the leaders in NYSUT, represents the rest of the state, New York City, UFP, with respect to the impact of the lack of laptops or iPads and connectivity? Talk to us, please. Turn off your, unmute yourself, Randy.
One of the biggest areas are homeless kids, which are about 10% of the kids in New York City. Most of the shelters or the don't have connectivity in that kind of way. So there are places in New York, from the North Country to New York City, where the only thing that's going to work is hotspots. And, look, I'm on a bus for 30 days from, as I said, from California to Florida, and hotspots work for a moment and then they don't work. And so the hotspots are not really reliable. We have spent, as the AFT, And it's the Dalio Foundation, just going back to Connecticut, has been amazing. And they also did something, I know this is off topic, but they also did something really wonderful in helping to train teachers all across Connecticut on social emotional issues and on how to deal with and really become a social emotional advocate and activist now, given everything that kids are reckoning with. And so I just want to, give them a high five for what they did in terms of that. But it's just, again, and I think Superintendent Thurman said this before, I would actually argue that connectivity should be like radio waves. Because even if you have it as electricity, think about the parents. I live in, as Robert knows, I still live in Inwood, New York. And I'm Robert is my senator. I'm voting on when I come back on Monday or Sunday, but early vote, and then getting back on the road. But the bottom line is, Spectrum costs us in my household over $200 a month. We can afford that. So we actually need to make sure that kids have connectivity for free and that we have broadband access. Because even when we get back to school, we need to make sure that this, or in school, we need to make sure that this connectivity is there for everyone.
Well, thank you. So now I'm going to turn to the program coordinator. I'm supposed to take a couple of questions from audience, and then we're going to wrap up, if you don't mind. So let me turn.
Hello, everybody. Hi, this is Diana Cruz with Hispanic Federation, and we will have the opportunity to take a couple of questions from audience, 1 to 2 questions. There is a little button that says grab the mic. So we will invite anybody from the audience to grab the mic, and we will choose 1 to 2 people to be able to ask the question through the video if they want to. Otherwise, you can also add it on the chat room. Again, we would love to take 1 to 2 questions for the remaining of the session. And thank you so much to all the panelists who have joined us today.
So are we going to take 1 or 2 questions?
Yes, we will take so if whoever's interested in asking a question, you just have to grab the mic. There's a little link on next to the chat box for whoever wants to ask the question. It looks like Alejandra Rodriguez, a community outreach liaison, wants to ask a question. So we're going to bring her on stage, and she will be asking her question live to us right now.
All right, Alexandra, you're on.
Alejandrina.
Much for taking my question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I know about the satellite, and I know about all the connectivities that all the kids in the whole country been having issues. My question is, they've been sending a lot of satellites to the space I don't know if this could benefit in a better for our internet, and will this be something that we can, something promised for the students?
Maybe instead of Space Wars, we should be thinking about putting satellites up there. I think that's a great suggestion.
Alejandra, we are looking to pilot the satellite use in California to provide, broadband in places where the infrastructure doesn't exist. Mostly the internet companies have chosen not to build the infrastructure because they don't think there's enough profit in our rural communities. They say there's just not enough people. We say our people are more than just the profit and they deserve this. And so it's expensive, but we are in conversation with some companies about the satellite. We're even launching an innovation competition to see if some new entrepreneur innovator can come up with another solution to help us figure out how to get broadband accessible for all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alejandrina, for your question. We will have time for one more question, and then we will thank the panelists for joining us today. Anybody else that wants to ask a question, you can grab the mic and join us on stage, or just add your question on the chat box. Anybody else?
Well, while we see if anybody else coming on, let me thank all the panelists, and I'm sorry I didn't get to every question I wanted to ask you. So Tony Thurman, the State Superintendent of Public Education of California, give her a hand. And we have the Connecticut State Department of Education Superintendent, Dr. Miguel Cardona, and we have the Associate Commissioner for Bilingual Education and World Languages, the New York State Education Department, and we have Dr. Ayala, the Superintendent from Illinois. Thank you for all coming. Let me just thank you. I've said basically that we have to be flexible in dealing with this education of our children, and if we're not flexible, we will crack and break. And so you have to be flexible. So, and Randy, let me thank you. Obviously, you're the voice of all of labor and all of the teachers and staff basically in the entire country. And we thank you as a president of AFT. Obviously, that's extremely important because you need the balance. And as people said, you need parents, you need legislators, you need advocates, you need labor people come together on behalf of the whole. And so with that, I say to all of you, thank you very much. Thank you. How do you say thank you in Spanish? Gracias a todos. And assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. In Swahili, asante sana, meaning thank you.
El gusto es nuestro, Senator Jackson. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that we had one more question. Please join us online by hashtag Hispanic Ed. We will have expos right after this session that we invite everybody to join us. We want to make sure that not only you learn about what Hispanic Federation is doing in education, but we're also focusing on immigration, civic engagement, health. There are various other pillars that we're presenting. So we want to invite everybody to join us at our booth expo right after this session. Thank you once again. I know that we couldn't take one last question, Keith. Thank you so much for at least raising your hand. But if you want to join us for further events, we will definitely take your questions later on.
Well, thank you, and thank the Hispanic Federation for putting this together on behalf of all of the people that are zooming in order to hear what our experts have to say. Thank you, Hispanic Federation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe and well.
Adelante siempre.
Be well.
Gracias. Nos
Gracias
vemos.
a todos.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias. Que estén bien.
Gracias.